and welcome. You're watching Head to Head with UATV. I'm Oles Gerjuk. Today we're talking about the scars of the Holocaust. Calculating the exact number of victims difficult, but according to the latest data, around 6 million Jews, men, women and children were slaughtered by Nazi Germany and its collaborators during World War II. In 2005, to commemorate the memory of the victims, the first International Holocaust Remembrance Day was created by the United Nations General Assembly. Now it happens on January 27th every year since. On this occasion, to get more enlightened on the issue, we're joined in the studio by historian Viacheslav Likhachov. Hello and thank you for coming.
Good afternoon.
Mr. Likhachov, could you tell our audience why exactly January the 27th was selected for the Remembrance Day?
It is the day of the liberation of the Nazi death camp Auschwitz in 1945 by Soviet army. And Auschwitz was the symbolic center of the tragedy of the Jewish people during World War II. It was the most large death camp established by Nazi. So the day when the extermination of the Jewish people in this very center was ended by the Soviet army became a day of the remembrance.
Well, this Remembrance Day was created in 2005. Why do you think it took 60 years for that? Since 1945?
You know, there were several stages of the reflections of the Holocaust in the world. Right after the war, when it was Nuremberg trial, it seems that all the Nazi war crimes were punished, all the criminals were punished, and that's something that we must go to the next page and forget about it. It was an influence to the international humanitarian law, the lessons of the tragedy of the war in general and of Holocaust especially, but it was not a kind of a public reflection of what Holocaust was, how it could be, and what we could do now about this tragedy for the future. In the 60s, when the new generation grew, and for this new people, the silence of the world during the tragedy of the Jewish people became as tragic as the tragedy itself. So it became the new wave of reflections and what the whole world, the universe, could do with this memory. There were some symbolic events like trial on Eichmann, who was the chief Nazi official, was responsible for the final solution of the Jewish question. The trial was in Israel, and it was an event that was very famous and controversial for all over the world, and it was the beginning of the new stage of the reflections on the lessons of the Holocaust. And now, step by step, world came to understanding that this tragedy was not a separate tragedy of the Jewish people. It was a tragedy of the humanity in general. It is something.
Who else was involved among victims? Who else was among victims of this genocide?
Holocaust is the very name for the genocide of the Jewish people, but also Nazi crimes exterminated Roma and Sinti people in Europe, and some other groups like homosexual, the witnesses of Jehovah, church membering, and some people with psychiatric diagnosis. But the Holocaust is the very name of the extermination of the Jewish people. The genocide of Roma people has its own name and its own Remembrance Day.
Why is it actually named Holocaust? What does this word mean?
It's not a simple question, because, for example, for Jewish community and for Israel there is another one name, And Holocaust is the Greek word from the Holy Bible, which means the sacrifice in a Jerusalem temple.
By fire.
By fire, yes. And this meaning of, from one hand, sacrifice, burning, became good name for the Jewish tragedy, but a Jewish community itself has another understanding of this tragedy.
How does the Jewish community understand this?
There is a word from Hebrew, Shoah. Shoah is just a catastrophe. And in Israel, the official name of the tragedy is Shoah. And by the way, Israel has its own day of remembrance of the tragedy of Shoah in spring, in the day of the beginning of the Warsaw Upspring.
So what you mentioned is that the attention to the Holocaust became active in 1960s, right? Then how has the awareness and the attitude to the genocide been changing afterwards?
Step by step, in different concrete spheres like education, culture, state, politics of memory, more and more the universalization of the understanding, the memory of this tragedy became more and more normal. And now, for example, the tragedy of Syrian refugees in Europe is understanding through the prism of the lessons of Holocaust, because Holocaust became a symbol not only of the very crime, but also the symbol of the silence of the
silence about the
nations.
massive crime.
Yes, and the main lesson from Holocaust is that we need to do something when something tragic appear in any point of the world. And it is the background for the understanding of the lessons of the Holocaust now all over the world, and it is the something which push the international humanitarian agenda in some concrete spheres nowadays.
Yeah, sure. Well, now let's focus a bit more on Ukraine. How Ukraine's memory of the Holocaust have shifted over the years?
Ukraine, as well as other parts of the Soviet Union, till 1990s, was out of this world context of the remembrance and reflections of the Holocaust.
So there was no knowledge here about this?
No knowledge, no memory. There were just civil Soviet citizens, civil victims of Nazi occupation,
and
but not named by the Jews.
Probably the Soviet regime tried even to hide the facts of the greatest massacre.
Yes, it was partly because of internal politics, partly because of foreign politics, because Israel became a kind of enemy of the Soviet Union.
So that was one of the reasons why to hide,
yes,
because why to hide Nazis' crimes, basically.
It was one of the reasons. Another reason was that the Soviet Union has its own anti-Semitic politics. So the memory and the scholar studies and memorialization of the tragedy became only an independent Ukraine. And during last 27 years, Ukraine passed through some very important stages. Now Holocaust exists in university historical curriculum, in schools historical curriculum. There are a lot of memorials of the victims of the Holocaust. Of course, not on the same level as in Europe it is now, but we see that the state, the government, and the civil society and the Jewish community made enormous efforts to create this cultural of memory, which is European culture.
So people are more aware of this now, as I understand you, right? From what I know, only last year the project of rebuilding the cemetery for the victims of Holocaust was launched in Kiev. How do you think, why did it take 26 years for that, since our independence?
Like in many other cases, there was not a systematically governmental and society politics on a memorialization in the very Babi Yar. There are now about 28, if I am not mistaken, different separate little monuments on the territory of Babi Yar, which were established mostly by the public. And after the 75 anniversary memorial events a year and a half ago in Kiev, their question became more and more systematically overviewed. And by the state, by the Jewish community, by the civil society, by some international actors. So now there are two projects of the museum in Babi Yar. One is the little project of the museum of the very Babi Yar tragedy, and another one, a little bit controversial one, is the large memorial on Holocaust in general. Near
What is the
Babi Yar.
controversy about?
It is the project which was the initiative of creating this memorial come from some businessmen with Russian business. Most of them have their roots in Ukraine and have some sentiments in Ukraine, but now their most part of their business affairs are in Russia, and the Ukrainian society, Ukrainian historians, and in more wide public discussion, there are doubts if the conception of the memorial will be under the influence of the official Kremlin discourse about the role of the Ukrainian collaborators in the extermination of the Jews during the war, and some other topics which are very actively used in a Russian anti-Ukrainian propaganda now.
So what is the discussion about right now? This topic is controversial, but what would you think would happen next?
We just don't know exactly yet, because the initiative of this memorial is just in the stage of creating the conception. The first overview of the conception was presented at the end of the previous year for the public, and it was not the whole conception, it was only a short summary. And during the discussion there were a lot of questions. Will it be the memorial only of the memory of the Ukrainian Jews during the war, or it will have European ambitions? And if the last one version, why Kyiv became a symbol of Holocaust in Eastern Europe? Is it an adequate perspective? And the question of the place of non-Jewish victims also was discussed, and the place of the Ukrainian collaborators with Nazi was discussed very actively. So right now we just don't know what will be the final version of the conception, but the public came from the very skeptical background just because the money came from Russia.
From Russia. Okay, I got this. And the very last but interesting question, how comfortable does Jewish population feel in Ukraine right now?
If you mean the real level of anti-Semitism, of course there is anti-Semitism in Ukraine as well as in any other country, even without Jewish community. But if we compare the results of the monitoring of anti-Semitic hate crimes in Ukraine with Western European countries, for example, we can see that the Jewish community in Ukraine now is much more safer than the Jewish community in Western Europe. For example, during the previous year, 2017, there were no one case of anti-Semitic violence against
Jewish
physical
population?
person against Jews. And there are dozens of cases in countries like France or even Great Britain.
Wow.
So there is some level of anti-Semitic rhetoric in public, which is a strange thing for the European context. But there is no real threat for the Jews physically and for the Jewish community in general in Ukraine now.
That's very important. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but thank you so much for this interesting conversation.
Thank you.
That was historian Viacheslav Likhachov. Thank you for watching Head to Head. I'm Oles Gerjuk. Goodbye.